The wind carried with it the scent of pine and ash, the kind of fragrance that lingers when a man has lived too long in silence. His cabin stood alone against the wide valley, logs darkened by years of storms, a crooked fence leaning toward the earth, like it too had grown tired of standing. Elias Boone had carved this place out of solitude, every board and stone shaped by his own hands, not to build a home, but to build a cage where grief could not escape. After the fever took his wife and boy, words had dried in his throat, laughter had vanished like smoke in the cold air, and only the rhythm of chores, splitting wood, mending fences, boiling beans, kept the hours from devouring him whole. It was a life measured not in joy, but in the steady beat of survival. And yet, even in the quiet he thought he wanted, something in him still longed for the warmth of another soul, though he would never admit it. That longing was buried, hidden beneath layers of dust and memory, waiting for a spark that might never come. It was on an evening when the sky had surrendered its colors to a dull, endless gray that his life began to shift. The river, usually a place of water and silence, carried with it an unfamiliar shape. He saw it first as a smear of motion, half caught among stones and driftwood. His instincts told him to turn away, to let the current claim whatever it had brought. But his heart, bruised as it was, still beat with a stubborn trace of compassion. He stepped closer, boots crunching against gravel, until the form revealed itself. A woman, her skin pale from the cold, hair tangled with mud and water, her leg twisted cruelly beneath her. She should not have survived the river's pull, and yet her chest still rose and fell, each breath thin and fragile, as if life itself hesitated before leaving her. Elias's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from recognition of the familiar shadow of loss. He had seen too many bodies in his lifetime, too many stories ended before their time. For a moment he hesitated, knowing the trouble that helping her might invite. But compassion broke through the armor he had built around himself. He bent down, gathering her carefully into his arms. Her weight was nothing, as though sorrow itself had hollowed her out. But even in her weakness there was a presence about her, a quiet strength wrapped in silence. The air turned sharper as he carried her back to his cabin, each step heavy with a choice that could not be undone. Inside the cabin he laid her upon his bed, the only soft place within those 4 wooden walls. Fire crackled again as he fed the stove, and healing warmth filled the room. He cleaned her wounds with the few remnants of medicine he had kept since his days in uniform, each movement careful, reverent almost, as though tending to her was a prayer whispered into the dark. When her eyes fluttered open, brown and deep as the earth itself, she looked at him without fear, and with the faintest whisper asked a single question: why? Elias had no answer that could hold the weight of all his grief, so he told her the only truth he knew. He could not bear to see another life abandoned to silence. From that moment, the quiet of the cabin was no longer the same. It was no longer just the echo of his sorrow, but the fragile beginnings of something else, something tender and alive. He found himself listening for her breath, watching the way her fingers shifted against the blanket, noticing how even in pain she carried herself with dignity. He did not know her name yet, nor the story carved into her scars, but he felt it already. Fate had delivered her to his door not as a burden, but as a chance to awaken what had long been buried within him. This beginning was not loud, not dramatic, but soft, like a seed pushing through frozen earth, fragile yet certain. And as the days that followed brought questions, dangers, and revelations, the bond that formed between them would prove stronger than either of them had ever expected. Love often arrives not with grand gestures, but in the quiet decision to care for someone when it would be easier to walk away. If you feel this story touching something gentle in your heart, like a small light pushing away the cold, I invite you to stay with it. Let it be healing for your soul, as every chapter carries not just love, but the reminder that broken lives can be stitched back together. And if this warmth reaches you, let me know in the comments, share your thoughts, and subscribe, so that together we can keep these stories alive, weaving connection where silence once ruled. The night outside deepened, but inside the cabin a different fire had begun, one that would lead them from strangers bound by chance to something neither of them had dared hope for. And so the story moves forward, carrying with it the tender thread of a love that was only beginning to take shape. Morning crept gently into the cabin, carrying with it the faint light of dawn that filtered through the warped panes of glass and settled across the floorboards like pale ribbons of gold. Elias stirred from the chair where he had dozed, his neck stiff, his hand still resting near the rifle that never strayed too far from reach. For years he had woken to emptiness, to the sound of nothing but his own breath and the rustle of wind pressing against the shutters. Yet now the first thing he noticed was the soft rhythm of another's breathing, steady and fragile, like a bird resting within the safety of his walls. She had survived the night. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening with awareness. They found him across the room, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It carried weight, unspoken questions, and something tender beginning to unfold. Elias rose quietly, his joints aching from the cold, and tended the fire, coaxing flames to life with cedar kindling. The room warmed quickly, and with it came the faint smell of coffee as he set the pot upon the stove. She watched him without words, her gaze cautious but not fearful, as if trying to measure who he truly was beneath the hardened edges. When he returned to her side, he checked the wound at her ribs, the swelling at her ankle. His touch was gentle, his rough hands moving with a kind of healing care that surprised even him. She winced, yet she did not pull away. "This will sting," he said softly, pouring warm water over the cut, cleansing away what the river had left behind. She closed her eyes briefly, her fingers curling against the blanket, but her strength showed in the way she endured without complaint. He found himself admiring it, the quiet resilience that mirrored his own survival through years of grief. He introduced himself in a voice that carried the gravel of solitude. "Elias," he murmured, his gaze steady, as though giving his name was offering a part of himself he had long withheld. After a pause, she whispered back, "Sana." Her name was a balm, soft and healing, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. He repeated it once under his breath, tasting it as though anchoring her presence to his world. They shared their first meal together in silence. Beans, black and thick, spooned into tin plates. She ate slowly, leaning against the cot for support, her dignity intact even in weakness. Elias did not press her for more than she wished to give. He knew the language of silence well, and in her silence he found something familiar, the strength of a soul who had endured pain without breaking. When she finally spoke, it was with words that confirmed his suspicions. She told him of an ambush, of men who had pursued her across the ridges, leaving her wounded and alone by the river's edge. Her voice did not tremble, though the shadows of memory lingered in her eyes. Elias listened, his jaw tightening, his heart stirring with both anger at her suffering and respect for the courage it had taken her to survive. "You'll be here for a while," he told her plainly, noting the state of her injuries. She looked at him then, her gaze steady, and asked in a voice nearly broken, "Will you turn me out?" His reply came with quiet certainty, "No." At that, something in her shoulders eased, barely noticeable, but enough for him to feel the fragile beginning of trust weaving itself between them. Days began to pass in measured rhythm. Elias tended his cattle, split wood, repaired fences. Yet every task now carried with it an awareness of the woman inside his cabin. When he returned, her presence filled the space with something new, something warm and quietly healing. She began to move on her own, propped on crude crutches he had fashioned for her, refusing to let injury steal her dignity. Her strength impressed him, though he never said it aloud. Instead, he noticed the way she stitched her torn dress with careful hands, the way she observed everything in silence before offering words that carried weight when spoken. One evening, as the fire painted the walls with orange light, she confessed that her father had sent her north with a message meant to stop a trade of rifles for food. It had been betrayal, men lying in wait, their ambush leaving her broken beside the water. Elias absorbed her story without judgment, only the quiet certainty that danger would follow her here. He did not flinch from it. Instead, he promised what she did not ask for, that he would deal with whatever came. Her gaze softened then, and though no gratitude crossed her lips, recognition did. Trust, like love, does not bloom in sudden bursts. It grows in the spaces between words, in the care offered without expectation, in the healing that comes when one broken soul recognizes another. Elias and Sana moved carefully around one another, as though afraid to disturb the delicate thread forming between them. And yet, each moment stitched them closer. The way he brewed coffee without asking if she wanted it, the way she swept the cabin floor as though it had always been her place to tend, the way silence between them no longer felt like absence, but presence. It was not yet love, not yet spoken, but something was taking root, fragile and undeniable. Outside, the wind whispered across the valley, carrying with it the promise of storms and danger yet to come. Inside, however, within the glow of fire and the warmth of shared breaths, a different storm was quietly gathering, one that would draw them together not by chance, but by choice. And so, without either of them naming it, their story was already shifting into something deeper, something that would carry them through trials neither of them could yet imagine. The days unfolded with a rhythm neither of them had anticipated, as if time itself slowed to allow space for their quiet healing. Frost clung to the windows in delicate lace, the stove's warmth pushing back the cold, while inside the cabin the fragile bond between Elias and Sana deepened. She leaned upon the crutches he had carved, each movement careful but determined, her dignity never lost. Elias found himself watching without meaning to, the way her hair caught the light of the fire, the steady grace with which she carried pain, and the silence that was no longer heavy but strangely comforting. One morning she sat at the small table stitching her torn dress, her fingers working with patience, her eyes lowered in concentration. Elias paused in the doorway, arms full of wood, struck by how natural her presence looked there, as though the cabin had been waiting for her all along. He set the wood aside and simply watched. She glanced up, catching his gaze, and though she did not smile, there was an understanding in her eyes, an unspoken acceptance that his world was no longer his alone. Their conversations grew slowly, like fire coaxed from embers. She asked if he had always lived alone, and he spoke of the fever that had taken his wife and son. He expected pity, but she gave only silence, a silence that felt like respect. In return, she revealed pieces of her own past. How her father had trusted her with messages of importance, how betrayal had left her wounded by the river. She spoke plainly, with strength, as if to remind both of them that she was not merely a victim, but someone who had endured. In her voice, Elias heard echoes of his own survival, and it bound them together more surely than words of comfort ever could. Danger lingered beyond the cabin walls. Smoke rose on the western ridge one afternoon, a thin column that spoke of riders who hunted rather than wandered. Sana saw it first, her eyes narrowing, her hand tightening on the edge of the table. Elias lifted the spyglass he kept from his days as a scout, spotting two figures with horses tied beneath the bluff. They did not build a fire for warmth, they built it as a signal. Their presence confirmed what both had known since the first night. Her enemies were not finished, yet instead of fear, there was a quiet strength in the cabin. Elias cleaned his rifle by the fire that evening, his movements steady, not hurried. Sana sat nearby, twisting fibers of willow bark into thin cord, her face calm, though her eyes remained sharp. The unspoken vow between them deepened. He would not turn her away, and she would not yield to those who sought her capture. When she finally whispered, "My father will come," Elias met her gaze with equal certainty. "Then we'll be ready when he does." The bond forming between them was not built on passion's fire, but on resilience, on the trust that grows when two wounded souls find shelter in one another. In the quiet moments, the sharing of beans at the table, the steady pouring of coffee, the sound of her breath as she slept, Elias felt something stirring within him, something long buried yet unmistakably alive. And Sana, though she did not speak of it, lingered in her gaze upon him, as though seeing in his presence a sanctuary she had never known. One night, as the wind pressed against the cabin and the fire burned low, she confessed in a low voice that she had once been promised to a man chosen by her people. Her father had given her the choice, rare as it was, and she had refused. "He was not the man I wanted," she said, her eyes holding Elias's across the flames. Elias did not answer right away, but something shifted in his chest, a recognition that her honesty was a gift she had not needed to give. He realized then that trust was no longer fragile. It was real, and it was growing. When danger drew near again, it was met not with panic, but with shared resolve. 3 men stepped out from the trees one night, calling across the clearing, their voices smooth with lies. Elias stood firm, rifle loose in his hand, refusing to yield. Sana, despite her injuries, stepped to the porch with her crutches, her presence beside him a silent declaration that she would not be taken, not while he stood with her. The men left with threats of return, but the bond between Elias and Sana had been sealed in that moment, 2 lives standing together against the darkness. Afterward, in the stillness of the cabin, Sana turned to him and asked quietly, "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her, the weight of years of loss heavy in his voice, and answered simply, Because you stayed. Her eyes lingered on his, and though no more words followed, the silence carried with it the warmth of something undeniable. The nights grew colder, but inside, the cabin was no longer just a refuge from winter. It had become the cradle of something new, tender yet strong, fragile yet healing. Elias no longer listened only for danger outside the door. He listened for the sound of her breath, for the rhythm of a life that reminded him he was not alone. And Sana, in her quiet strength, began to let herself rest, not as a fugitive, not as a burden, but as a woman who had found shelter in more than walls. The healing had begun, not of wounds alone, but of hearts long silent. And as snow deepened across the valley, the bond between them grew, preparing them for the moment when her father would arrive and test the meaning of what they had found together. Frost had crept up the lower panes of the window, delicate veins of ice that caught the weak morning light. Elias rose before dawn as he always did, the rhythm of chores embedded into his bones, but now every sound he made inside the cabin, every scrape of the chair, every stir of the fire, was measured against the presence of the woman who slept only a few steps away. Sana stirred lightly, never fully surrendered to rest, her shoulders curled forward, as if her body remembered too well the need to flee. He watched her in those fragile hours, the rise and fall of her breath, the way her hand never strayed far from the knife he had left by her bedside. Trust was growing between them, but scars had taught her to keep a weapon close. When she woke, she pulled herself upright with her crutches, her face pale yet steady. Elias handed her a tin cup of coffee, his fingers brushing hers for only a second. It was a small thing, almost nothing, yet it carried a warmth neither of them acknowledged aloud. She accepted it without ceremony, her eyes drifting toward the frost-glazed window, as if searching for signs of the men who had threatened them days before. Elias had seen their tracks, the careful way they circled the ridges, not retreating, but waiting. He knew danger was close, but inside this cabin there was a different battle unfolding, quieter but no less powerful, the slow weaving of two lives once broken, now beginning to mend. They moved around each other with ease, like two rivers learning how to join. Elias split cedar near the barn, each swing of the axe echoing in the valley, while Sana stripped sagebrush and wove cord with careful hands. She moved with patience, her injured ankle still tender but no longer swollen, her strength returning in ways that surprised him. He admired her quiet resilience, the way she refused to be a shadow despite the weight of her wounds. When she swept the floor with a bundle of brush tied in canvas, the cabin looked less like a solitary shelter and more like a place where life could grow. For years, it had been nothing but walls to keep out the cold. Now, under her touch, it began to feel like home. Evenings were when their words carried the most weight. The fire painted their faces in shades of amber, and silence stretched between them, not empty, but full. One night, Sana told him of her father, of how he had once been a tracker before becoming a chief, a man who could read the land like a book. "He will come," she said softly, eyes lowered but steady. Elias nodded, understanding that her fate was not hers alone. Yet when she looked up, there was something unspoken in her gaze, a fear not of her enemies, but of what her father might think if he found her here. Alive, yes, but healed by the hands of a man she was not supposed to know. Elias met her stare, his voice calm but unyielding. "This land is mine. This cabin is mine. You are not a prisoner here. If you choose to leave when you're healed, you can. But if they come looking before then, I face them." The recognition in her eyes was not gratitude, but something deeper, respect, perhaps, or the beginning of trust that had roots. The days unfolded in fragile balance. They ate at the same table, sharing beans, bread, and silence that spoke more than words. Sometimes her gaze lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. Sometimes he found his thoughts wandering to her, even while his hands worked the fences or gathered wood. They were both survivors of different wars, and in that recognition their connection grew stronger. The healing was no longer just of body, but of soul. His grief softened in her presence, her fears quieted in his steadiness. Then the smoke came again on the western ridge, a clean line too deliberate to be hunters. Sana saw it from the doorway, her crutches braced against the packed earth, the blanket still around her shoulders. "They're still searching," she murmured. Elias raised the old spyglass, confirming her words. 2 horses, 2 men, waiting like shadows near the bluff. They would not give up easily. He closed the glass and set it aside, his voice steady. "Let them wait. I don't run." Sana's eyes studied him, sharp and searching. Finally she spoke, her words quieter, but carrying weight. "You're not like the others." He did not answer with words, only a small shrug, but her statement lingered between them, warming the silence like firewood catching flame. That night, when the fire burned low, Sana sat wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her gaze lost in the embers. "If my father comes," she said finally, "he will not greet you with open hands." Elias looked at her across the glow, his face calm. "I wouldn't expect him to, but he'll know what I did. He'll see it." For a long time she did not respond, only watching him as though weighing his heart against his words. Then, in a voice low and healing, she whispered, "You could have left me in the river. You didn't." He met her eyes and answered with quiet certainty, "I don't leave people behind." Neither of them looked away after that, and the air between them shifted, no longer strangers, no longer bound only by circumstance. Outside, the valley lay under the hush of winter, the trees heavy with cold. Inside, within the small glow of the cabin, something tender was beginning to take root. It was not yet spoken, not yet defined, but it was alive. A warmth that would grow stronger with each passing day, carrying them toward the moment when the world outside would test what they had found in each other. The third morning came with frost thick across the valley, the kind that glittered like crushed glass beneath the rising sun. Elias stepped outside with his rifle slung low, breath clouding in the frozen air, his boots pressing tracks into the brittle ground. Every sense told him danger still lingered beyond the tree line. The woods were too quiet, the wind carrying not bird-song, but only its own steady whisper. He found tracks easily. 3 horses had circled to the western bluff, their riders shifting position rather than retreating. When he crouched by the pine trunk at the ridge, his hand brushed over 3 carved slashes in the bark. An old Apache sign, warning and direction. His pulse tightened. Sana's father was near. When he returned to the cabin, Sana was already awake, her blanket drawn close around her shoulders, crutches leaning against the table. She looked at him as though she already knew. "They're close," he confirmed. "But not alone. Your father leaves signs." Her face softened with recognition, a shadow of relief in her eyes, though beneath it flickered worry. "He won't come until he's certain of me. He'll watch first." Elias nodded, pouring water into the kettle, setting it on the stove as if routine might steady them both. Yet the air inside the cabin carried new weight. The knowledge that soon her father would stand here, measuring the man who had sheltered his daughter. That day passed with a strange stillness, their movements deliberate, every task performed with unspoken awareness of what was coming. Elias repaired the hinge on the barn door, his knife shaping the wood with slow precision, while Sana stripped sagebrush into strands for weaving. She leaned carefully on her crutches, no longer fragile but strong-willed, her ankles still tender, but her spirit unbroken. Elias found himself watching her again and again, not only with protectiveness, but with something deeper, something warm and healing, like a man seeing the possibility of a new life for the first time in years. By midday, the wind shifted. Elias caught the faint smell of smoke on the air, campfire smoke carried thin across the valley. Moments later, the sound of hooves reached him, measured, unhurried, not the rush of an enemy, but the steady rhythm of someone who belonged to the land. He lifted his rifle out of habit, but did not raise it. A rider emerged from the trees, tall on a dark stallion, shoulders broad, long braids marked with bone and leather. Elias knew the stories, and now he knew the man, Takakota, the chief, the father. The horse slowed near the cabin. Sana stepped into the doorway, her crutches braced, the blanket slipping from her shoulders as she stood in the open air. For a moment, she was no longer the injured woman Elias had pulled from the river, but a daughter facing her father's gaze. Takakota dismounted without haste, his face solemn, his eyes sharp as they moved from his daughter to Elias. The silence between the three of them was heavier than any words. Elias stood firm, his feet planted in the earth, his rifle resting but ready. "You found her?" the chief asked at last, his voice deep, carrying both authority and restrained emotion. "I pulled her from the river," Elias answered evenly. "You helped her?" Takakota pressed. Elias's voice did not falter. "I fed her, mended her wounds, protected her." The chief studied him, eyes searching not for words, but for truth in his bearing. At last he turned to his daughter, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as he took in the healed wounds, the steadiness in her gaze. Then he looked back at Elias. "Why?" The question struck deeper than Elias expected. He did not look away, his answer plain. "Because no one else would." Silence followed, stretching until the only sound was the crackle of the cabin's stove through the open door. Takakota's eyes softened slightly, and then he reached to his saddle, pulling free a bundle wrapped in hide. He placed it in his daughter's hands, a beaded pouch, a folded blanket, a carved token marked with tribal signs. His words to her were in his own tongue, quiet and full of meaning, freedom, remembrance, belonging. She took them with steady hands, her eyes shimmering, though no tears fell. Then Takakota looked to Elias once more. "If she stays with you," he said, his voice low but firm, "your name is hers now, not just for safety, for meaning." It was not threat, not warning, but recognition. Elias bowed his head once, understanding the weight of what had just been given. This was more than acceptance. It was trust, costly and rare. Without another word, the chief mounted his horse and rode back into the trees, leaving silence in his wake. Sana stood still, clutching the pouch, her eyes fixed on the fading figure of her father until he vanished beyond the ridge. Only then did she look at Elias. Her voice was soft, but it carried the strength of decision. "I don't need to go back. Not unless I choose to, and I choose this." Elias said nothing at first, the weight of her words settling into him like roots into soil. Slowly he reached out, taking the pouch from her hands, his thumb brushing over the beadwork as though sealing the promise unspoken between them. "We'll build something here," he said quietly. She met his gaze, steady as dawn breaking over the valley. "I want that." The clouds above parted for a moment, letting a shaft of sunlight spill across the cabin and the clearing. It touched the ground where they stood, two souls no longer strangers, but bound by choice. For Elias, the ache of old grief eased, replaced by a fragile hope that felt almost like breathing again. For Sana, the weight of pursuit lifted, leaving in its place the warmth of belonging. And together, as the silence stretched warm and healing around them, they knew that what had begun by the river had become something neither storm nor shadow could easily break. Beyond the valley, danger still lingered, but inside those wooden walls a seed had been planted. The days ahead would test them, yet for the first time both carried not only survival in their hearts, but the quiet certainty of love waiting to bloom. Spring broke quietly, not with storms or sudden warmth, but with a slow softening of the land. The last frost slipped away without ceremony, leaving behind the trickle of melted snow running down the riverbanks, the smell of damp soil rising from the ground. Elias stood on the porch one morning, his hat tipped low against the sun, and breathed in air that no longer tasted of winter. Behind him, the cabin had changed. It no longer carried only his silence. Herbs now hung from the rafters, baskets were stacked neatly in corners, and strips of dyed cloth added colour where bare wood had once dominated. Sana had left her touch everywhere, not intrusive, not forced, but in ways that turned survival into living. Her ankle had healed enough to carry her weight, though she still moved with care, each step deliberate. The limp was faint, but it remained a reminder of the river, of the danger that had once nearly stolen her life. She had made a dress from repurposed cloth and canvas, dyed with berries, simple but strong, and when Elias saw her in it beneath the morning sun, he felt something shift inside him, something that had nothing to do with gratitude or duty. She was no longer the broken figure he had carried from the water. She was becoming part of his world, woven into the fabric of his days. They settled into a rhythm. Elias tended fences and livestock, his hands rough with labor, while Sana prepared herbs, mended clothes, and walked the land beside him when her strength allowed. She learned the cattle by their moods, learned which ones needed coaxing and which responded to calm. She laughed once when a stubborn calf refused to follow his mother, a sound so rare and so unguarded that Elias nearly dropped the pail he was carrying. It was not loud, not forced, but warm, healing, like sunlight falling into the cracks of an old wall. He found himself working harder, if only to keep her near that light. Nights brought a quieter intimacy. They sat at the table sharing simple meals, beans and bread, the scent of sage steeping in the air. Sometimes they spoke of the past, his voice gravelly as he admitted the name of his wife, Clara, and the child taken by fever. His words came halting, but Sana did not interrupt or fill the silence. She let it stretch, let him breathe through the weight of memory until it no longer crushed him. "Love doesn't end when someone dies," he said softly one night, staring into the fire. "It waits, waiting for another place to live." Sana's eyes lingered on him then, dark and steady, her silence carrying the strength of understanding. She moved closer that night, sitting on the floor near his chair, her back lightly brushing against his knee. She did not reach for him, and he did not press, but the nearness itself was enough to quiet the ache inside both of them. The cabin became more than a refuge. It became a shared space where healing took root. Elias found himself listening for her footsteps, for the scrape of her chair, for the rustle of fabric when she worked. Her presence filled the emptiness that had haunted him for years, not by replacing what he had lost, but by weaving something new, something alive. She no longer carried the knife to bed every night. Sometimes she forgot it altogether, choosing rest without fear, trusting the walls and the man beside her. That small act, unspoken, meant more to Elias than words ever could. When Takakota returned 2 weeks after his first visit, the dawn was pale and cool. He spoke with Sana for nearly an hour inside the cabin, while Elias worked outside stacking wood. Their words were too soft for him to hear, but when the chief emerged, he handed Elias a carved token made of white pine, etched with Sana's mark and a crescent moon. "For protection," he said, his eyes sharp but calm. "Not from war. Protection from doubt." Elias accepted it without question, the weight of the token grounding him. That night, Sana told him plainly, "He knows I am not going back." It was not defiance, but choice. The days that followed felt lighter. They hitched the wagon and rode into town together for supplies. Elias had filed the land deed in both their names, a quiet act he revealed only when the clerk stamped it before them. Sana looked at him then with steady eyes, not surprised, but moved in a way she did not try to hide. The town watched as they passed, whispers trailing, but neither of them cared. They returned to the cabin with blankets, seeds, and the quiet satisfaction of something beginning to grow that was not bound by fear or loss. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Sana reached out for the first time, her hand resting lightly against his. His fingers curled over hers, rough against soft, and the world beyond those walls seemed to fall away. "You gave me more than my life back," she whispered, her voice low, steady. "You gave me something to stay for." Elias turned to her, his voice warm, his words simple. "And you gave me something to hope for." The night carried no urgency, only closeness. They shared the cot not out of necessity, but by choice, their bodies fitting not with desperation, but with the ease of two lives finally allowed to rest side by side. Outside, the last snow melted into the soil, feeding the earth. Inside, two hearts, long burdened by silence and sorrow, began to heal together, finding not just shelter, but a home. And as dawn returned once more, spilling gold across the valley, Elias and Sana stood at the threshold of a life neither of them had dared to imagine, one built not on survival alone, but on the warmth of love, quietly, tenderly, taking root. The land shifted with the season, trading the raw edge of spring for the slow warmth of early summer. Grass thickened across the valley, bending in waves when the wind swept through, and the cattle moved lazily, heads lowered as they grazed. Elias worked with steady hands, mending fences and tightening posts. But now the rhythm of his days carried a new presence. Sana moved beside him, no longer fragile, no longer bound by injury, her ankle healed enough for her to walk with grace. Her steps still held caution, yet her spirit was freer, her laughter surfacing at unexpected moments, like wildflowers blooming where no one had planted them. She had begun weaving cords from willow bark, shaping baskets that hung neatly from pegs along the cabin wall. She painted cloth with dyes made from crushed berries, filling the once empty space with color. The small cabin, which had for years carried the heavy silence of loss, now carried the hum of life. Elias found himself pausing more often, not to rest, but to simply watch her, the way the sunlight touched her hair, the concentration in her eyes as her fingers worked, the quiet dignity in her every movement. These were not things he would have thought to notice once, but now they seemed to him like gifts, healing pieces of a world he thought he had lost. They shared more words than before, though never too many. In the evenings they sat before the fire, her voice low as she spoke of her people, of nights spent listening to stories under the stars, of the songs her mother used to sing. Elias, in turn, told her of his childhood in a farmhouse that no longer stood, of riding fence lines with his father, of Clara and the boy he had buried. The pain in his voice no longer trembled as it once had, for speaking it to her was not reopening a wound, but letting it breathe. She listened without pity, her silence a salve. When she finally said, "Grief does not leave, but it can walk beside us without breaking us," Elias felt those words settle in him like a truth he had been waiting to hear. Their bond deepened in the smallest of gestures. When he came in from the fields with dirt on his hands, she would press a damp cloth into them without being asked. When she strained herself with work, he would steady her elbow, never lingering too long, but enough to remind her she was not alone. One afternoon, while repairing the roof, Elias looked down to see her holding the ladder with both hands, her face lifted toward him, steady and unflinching. Trust had taken root between them, and it was no longer silent. It was alive, blooming in every glance, every shared task, every moment of quiet understanding. The nights grew softer. They no longer sat across the room from one another, but close, her shoulder brushing his as they shared bread or beans. Sometimes she rested against him, her head tilted toward his arm, her presence a healing weight he had not known he craved. He began to sleep more soundly, the nightmares of war and fever retreating into the corners of his mind. When he woke, it was often to find her already moving, tending to herbs, humming softly in a voice that carried both strength and peace. One night, with the fire burning low, she asked him in a voice that was both fragile and firm, "Do you still love her?" Elias knew she meant Clara. He looked into the flames, the memories rising like smoke. "I do," he admitted quietly, "but love doesn't end when someone dies. It waits until it finds a place it can live again." His voice faltered slightly, but when he turned, her eyes held his without fear. "And has it found that place?" she asked. The silence between them was thick, but Elias did not turn away. "Maybe it has," he said softly, "if you'll let it." Sana did not answer with words. Instead, she moved closer, lowering herself to sit on the floor beside his chair, her back resting lightly against his knee, her presence steady and healing. She stayed there as the fire crackled low, and for the first time in years, Elias felt peace settle into him without resistance. It was not the peace of solitude or surrender, but of connection, two hearts finding rest beside each other. The next days brought quiet joy. They worked side by side, planting early seeds, carrying water, tending animals. At dusk, when the cattle settled, they walked the ridge together, her hand brushing against his, their silence no longer heavy, but filled with possibility. Elias found himself smiling at her without realizing, the corners of his mouth softening in ways they had forgotten. She smiled back, not shy, not uncertain, but sure. Love had come to them not in a sudden blaze, but in steady warmth, like the sun climbing higher each day, unnoticed until the world was bright again. Healing wrapped around them with every shared breath, every soft word, every night they fell asleep knowing the other was near. And though the world beyond the valley still carried shadows, inside the cabin and inside their hearts, light had taken root. It was not fragile anymore, it was enduring. And as summer deepened, they both understood without saying it aloud. They had chosen one another, and that choice was becoming the foundation of everything yet to come. The last frost had long melted into the soil, leaving the valley rich with green. The river that once carried Sana to the edge of death now ran clear and bright, its current no longer a threat, but a song. The cabin stood unchanged in shape, but utterly transformed in spirit. Where once there had been silence, now there was life. Herbs drying from the rafters, baskets of woven reeds stacked neatly, fabrics dyed in berry hues, and the faint scent of sage and pine smoke mingling in the air. It was no longer a place of exile. It was a home. Elias rose before dawn as he always had, but his days were no longer marked by loneliness. He returned from the fields to find her waiting with bread still warm from the fire, or walked in to hear her humming low, her voice healing, weaving softness into the rough edges of his life. They moved together through their tasks, their rhythm natural, as though they had always shared this space. He found himself watching her not out of duty, but with quiet admiration, each glance a reminder of how far they had both come from loss into something whole. One afternoon, when the sun leaned westward, they rode into town together in his wagon. The townsfolk watched them with guarded curiosity. Elias Boone, the man known for silence, now riding with a woman at his side. Sana sat upright, her basket in her lap, her gaze steady, unashamed. Elias ignored the stares, his presence as solid as ever, but his hand brushed against hers on the bench, a touch small and grounding. At the store, he showed the clerk the deed bearing both their names. The man stamped it without fuss, and when Sana repeated Boone aloud, her voice calm and certain, Elias felt something inside him tighten, then release, as though a knot had finally been undone. Back at the cabin, life unfolded in quiet abundance. The fields grew with promise. The cattle moved easily through the pastures, and their evenings carried the warmth of firelight and shared meals. Sana often sat by the table weaving cords while Elias shaped wood into small carvings, simple things, tokens of hands busy not with survival, but with creation. They spoke of the future without needing grand declarations. She asked what he did each spring, and he told her of repairing roofs and painting trim. She answered with her own plans, planting herbs, dyeing cloth, tending the animals, their words layered like bricks, building something steady, something theirs. Love had not rushed upon them. It had not flared suddenly like lightning. Instead, it had grown like the earth beneath their feet, slow, steady, patient, yet unshakable. Elias, who had once buried his laughter, now found it rising again when she teased him gently. Sana, who had once clutched a knife in her sleep, now rested without fear, her breath soft and even in the dark. Healing had become their shared language, spoken in the way he filled her cup before his own, in the way she pressed his hand when silence grew too heavy, in the way they looked at one another without needing to explain. One evening, as the sky turned rose and gold, Elias placed a small wooden carving on the shelf above the door. He had shaped it quietly over days, a plaque etched with the word home. Sana stood beside him, her hand sliding into his, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. "This place is more than walls now," she said. He nodded, his voice low, steady. "It's ours." The simplicity of the words carried more weight than any vow could. That night they lay side by side on the cot, the warmth of their bodies pressed close. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, but inside there was no emptiness left, no ghosts clinging to the corners. Only the choice of two people who had walked through grief, through danger, and now through healing into love. They did not need to name it. It was alive in every touch, in every glance, in every breath they shared. And when dawn broke wide across the valley the next morning, sunlight spilling golden through the cabin window, Elias and Sana rose together, not as two broken souls, but as one life stitched carefully, tenderly, into belonging. Their story was no longer about survival. It was about love chosen freely, built patiently, and held fiercely against the world. If this story has warmed your heart, if it has given you even a small spark of healing or hope, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, to like this story if it touched you, and to subscribe so more moments like this can find their way to you. Every voice, every gesture of support keeps these stories alive, carrying light into the quiet places where it is most needed. Together, we can keep weaving these tales of love and resilience, reminders that no matter how cold the winter, spring will always come,